Welcome back. This week, I was going through a script that almost reads like a procedural, except the protagonist is a 23-year-old woman with a babysitting log and 4 years of quietly documented financial data. What she does with that information in her second life is not loud, it is precise. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The smell of lavender detergent hit Mara first. Always. It clung to every surface of the Aldridge home, to the couch cushions, to the throw blankets she folded each Thursday, to the twins' hair when she carried them to bed. Lavender and a faint trace of the vanilla candle Mrs. Aldridge kept burning on the kitchen island even when no one was home. Mara had been walking through that front door for 2 years. She knew which floorboard creaked near the mudroom, as she knew that little Caden only ate his carrots if they were cut into coins, not sticks, and that his sister Priya would throw a full performance if you put the wrong spoon next to her yogurt. She knew the security code, the Wi-Fi password, the name of the pediatrician, and the exact way to stack the dishwasher so Mr. Aldridge did not restack it the following morning with that particular tight-jawed silence he wore when something in his house was not exactly right. She knew this family, but that was her whole mistake. It was a Thursday in October when she arrived at the house and found the door already open. Not ajar. Open. Wide. Like someone had walked through it recently and not bothered to pull it shut behind them. Mara stepped into the entryway, and there was the lavender, and beneath it, something else. Something she identified 3 seconds before her brain caught up. Dahlia's perfume. White tea and bergamot. The $12 body spray from the pharmacy that her sister had been wearing since they were teenagers because she claimed it smelled expensive. It did not smell expensive, but Mara had spent 2 decades around it and knew it the same way she knew her own heartbeat. Dahlia was in the kitchen. Mara stood at the end of the hallway, hands still on the door handle, and watched. Her sister sat at the island with the vanilla candle, with a glass of Miss Aldridge's orange juice in front of her, the kind with the pulp that came from the organic grocery delivery. She was laughing at something Mrs. Aldridge had said, head tilted, one hand at her collarbone in that practiced gesture she had perfected somewhere around age 16. The gesture that said, "I am charming, and you should find me so." Priya was in her lap. Caden was on the floor near the back door, pushing a train along its track. And when he looked up once when Mara's shadow crossed the kitchen threshold, and then looked back down again without recognition, Mrs. Aldridge noticed her a beat after Caden did. "Oh, Mara." She said it the way you say a name when it's slightly inconvenient to be reminded of a person. Not cold, not cruel, just that specific warmth of someone who has already moved on and is being politely reminded of the previous arrangement. We've actually been meaning to reach out. What we should have called sooner. Dahlia did not look up immediately. She took one slow sip of the juice, set it down, and then turned. Her expression was neutral in the way a controlled environment is neutral. The temperature was set, the variables managed. She gave Mara the small smile that she had been giving her since childhood, the one that said, "I have already won and we both know it, so let's skip the part where you make a scene." "We've made a change," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Oh, Dahlia came highly recommended." Mara did not ask by whom. She already knew. Her sister had access to her phone the week before when Mara left it on the counter during Thanksgiving dinner at their mother's house. Dahlia had been in the kitchen, alone, for 12 minutes. Mara had counted them after the fact, because something in her stomach had noted the absence before her mind caught up. 12 minutes was enough time to scroll a contact list, to forward a few numbers, to type a quick message from a borrowed device that she would later claim was sent by Mara herself. Something like, "I'm taking a break from sitting for a few months. Thank you for everything." Something warm and final. She had lost the Aldridges. She would later discover she had also lost the Calloway family and the Brenners. 3 families. 2 years of steady income, of genuine relationships built on consistency and quiet competence. Gone in 12 minutes. She did not cry in the Aldridge kitchen. She thanked Mrs. Aldridge with a nod and walked back down the hallway past the creaking floorboard, out the door, and into the October air. Dahlia's perfume followed her out. It was in the fabric of her jacket, she realized. It had already settled in. She was 23. She had $640 in her checking account, a part-time position at a copy shop that paid $9 an hour, and 3 fewer clients than she'd had this morning. She had a notebook in her bag, a cheap composition book, black cover, where she kept detailed records of every family she worked for. Names, children's ages and allergies, preferred routines, payment history. She had been meticulous about it because she had always known, on some low frequency, that order was the only armor she had. Their mother had made sure both daughters understood early that the world was not arranged in their favor. But she had delivered that lesson to Mara through indifference and to Dahlia through excessive affirmation, and the results had been predictable. Mara walked home. It was 40 minutes, and she walked the whole thing because she needed to feel the pavement under her feet, needed the cold on her face, needed something external to match the clean, flat interior reality she was already constructing. No grief, not really, no performance of it, just the recording of facts and the beginning of analysis. What her sister had done was not impulsive. It was methodical. Dahlia had no particular interest in children and had never expressed any ambition related to childcare. She had done it because Mara had it, and taking things Mara had was a pattern that stretched back to a green bicycle when Mara was 9 and Dahlia was 11. It was not cruelty exactly, it was something more reflexive, a habit of acquisition that had never been discouraged. Mara let herself into her apartment, a studio above a dry cleaner's, $600 a month. The radiator made a sound like knuckles cracking when it turned on, and sat at her small kitchen table and opened the composition book. She read through every entry for the Aldridge account. 2 years, 49 entries. She had noted the children's milestones. She had noted when Mrs. Aldridge seemed stressed and what that stress looked like so she could adjust accordingly. She had noted Mr. Aldridge's preferences for the dishwasher. She read until the radiator cracked itself awake and the window glass went dark, and she was sitting in a pool of yellow lamplight with the composition book in both hands like it was something she was trying to remember how to hold. She did not find a third client that month or the month after. The copy shop cut her hours in January. By February, she was 3 weeks behind on rent. She had applied to 11 nanny positions and received polite rejections from 9 and silence from 2. She suspected Dahlia's name was involved in some of the rejections, though she could not prove it. What she could prove, what she documented in the composition book with the same neutrality she brought to everything, was the pattern. Dahlia had signed on with a small agency, the Hartwell Agency for Household Staffing, which had placed her with the Aldridges and the Callaways. She was charging more than Mara had charged. She was presenting credentials that Mara had quietly acquired over 2 years. The CPR certification, the sleep training methodology she'd spent 3 months learning, as her own. Mara called the Hartwell Agency once. She explained calmly that she was Dahlia's sister, that several of the credentials listed in Dahlia's profile had been obtained under Mara's name, and that she would be happy to provide documentation. The woman on the phone, a practiced, smooth voice, thanked her for her concern and said they would look into it. They did not call back. That was March. In April, she got the job at the diner. By June, she was sleeping 4 hours a night and spending the other 20 managing the slow financial dismantling of a life that had never been particularly well constructed to begin with. She had started a second notebook by then, a red one, where she kept different information. Not names and allergy charts, numbers, the rate Dahlia was charging, the names of every family the Hartwell Agency had placed her with, the commission structure agencies like Hartwell operated on. She did not know exactly why she was recording this. The habit of documentation was simply too deep to turn off. She did not see what was coming. She was crossing the intersection at Farwell and 9th on a Wednesday night in July, walking home from a double shift, when the car ran the light. She heard the horn a half second before impact, which was enough time for her brain to register that something was wrong, but not enough time to do anything about it. The last sensation was the pavement, which was rough and warm from a day of sun, and she thought very briefly of the Aldridge kitchen and the lavender detergent, and then she did not think anything at all. There was no white light, there was no corridor, no gentle beckoning. What there was, a sound. First, a high and specific sound she identified from deep in her memory before she opened her eyes, which was the sound of the old electric kettle in her mother's kitchen, the one with the chipped red handle that had been on the counter since Mara was small. And then the smell. That house, specific and immediate. The mildew in the grout of the bathroom tiles, her mother's particular brand of hand lotion, rose-scented, thick. And underneath it all, something that was simply age. Was the accumulation of years in a house where very little had been thrown away. She was in her childhood bedroom. She was 17. She knew this without looking at a mirror or a calendar. She knew it because the ceiling above her had 3 water stains in a specific configuration she had spent years staring at. One large, 2 small, and the large one shaped like a boot. And because the mattress had a particular resistance at the left side from where the spring had gone soft after she fell off her bike onto the edge of it when she was 12. And because from outside the door she could hear her mother's television at the exact volume that indicated her mother was awake but not yet interested in interacting with anyone. And because her body was 17, ice, which was a specific feeling she could not have described before this moment, but now recognized with complete clarity as the feeling of something being unworn. Not new, exactly, just not yet as used as it would become. She sat up. Her mind was 23. The memories, all of them through July and the intersection at Farwell and 9th, were intact and arranged in exact order. She ran through them with the same systematic attention she gave to the composition book. Starting point, her mother's kitchen, the kettle, the rose hand lotion. Everything she knew about the next 6 years of her life was available to her in the same way a reference library is available. She could access any of it by simply reaching for it. She reached for it. The Aldridges. They were still 5 years away. Their children would be born in another 2 years. Mrs. Aldridge's sister, whom Mara had met once at a birthday party when she was 21, worked at an investment firm in the city and had mentioned the family casually, which was how the connection had formed. That was still in the future, and she had 6 years before the intersection at Farwell and 9th, and she was 17, and the kettle was singing from the kitchen, and Dahlia was somewhere in this house. She thought about Dahlia for exactly 3 minutes. She sat on the edge of the bed with the water stains in her peripheral vision, and she examined her sister in the same way she would examine a documented risk. Dahlia was not going to change. She knew this with the same certainty she knew the color of her own hair. Dahlia's behavior was structural, not circumstantial. You could not prevent her from taking something by hiding it. You had to render the thing she wanted unnecessary. Which meant Mara needed to become something that could not be stolen from. She got up and went to the kitchen. Her mother was at the table with a mug and the television playing quietly from the living room. She looked up at Mara with the habitual assessment she wore, checking for signs of need that would require something from her, and then looked back at her mug. "You're up early." "I have some questions about our finances," Mara said. Her mother looked up again, this time with mild alarm. "I want to understand what we have and what we don't, and I want to understand how money works," Mara said. "I'm going to need you to be honest with me." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because I'm going to need to take care of myself," Mara said, which was so simply and factually true that her mother, who had a complicated relationship with directness, could not argue with it. That was the first morning. Yet she started writing that day, not in a composition book, but in a spiral-bound notebook she found in the junk drawer, a leftover from a school year. She wrote down everything she knew: the Aldridges, the Hartwell Agency, the green bicycle, the 12 minutes at Thanksgiving dinner, the intersection at Farwell and 9th. She wrote it all down, and then she set it aside and started a new page and wrote, "What I need to know." The list was long. I knew the first item was how money is actually structured and protected, not in the way school taught it. The second item was how childcare credentials and reputation actually function as professional capital. The third item was how to build something that cannot be replicated by someone who does not understand why it works. She was 17. She had 6 years. She went to the library that afternoon, a 20-minute walk past the dry cleaners where she would later live above, although she did not know that yet in this life, and she checked out 3 books. One on personal finance for beginners, one on business structure, one on estate and contract law, which was technically a law school text, and which she checked out because the librarian, an older woman named Miss Choi with reading glasses on a beaded cord, gave her a sideways look and then stamped it without comment. She started reading that night. The next 3 years were not cinematic. So there was no training montage, no music, no moment where the protagonist stands at a window in the rain and understands something profound. There was Mara at the kitchen table with a book, or Mara at the computer in the library, or Mara in a conversation with someone who knew something she didn't and asking them precise, unhurried questions until she understood it. There was the part-time job at the grocery store that she took at 17 and kept through junior year because she was saving with a specific number in mind. There was the babysitting she started immediately. 3 families by the end of her first year back, all carefully selected, all documented in a composition book she bought specifically for the purpose. This time, she did not leave her phone unattended. She had not told anyone about the rebirth. It was not a secret she needed to protect with effort. It simply did not come up. She was 17, and then 18, and then 19. And the people around her were operating under the assumption that she was simply becoming. Becoming what? They weren't sure. Her mother thought perhaps practical, perhaps a little cold in a way that she found mildly unsettling. Dahlia thought she was becoming boring. Dahlia was 21 by the time Mara turned 19. She had dropped out of 2 semesters of community college and was working at a clothing boutique, which she described to everyone who asked as temporary, because the implication was that something better was forming around the corner. Dahlia was very good at implying. She moved through rooms like someone who had already been offered the best seat. She had not yet gotten into childcare. That would come. Mara knew exactly when. The Thanksgiving dinner 5 years out. But for now, Dahlia's attention was elsewhere, and Mara used that elsewhere like a window left open. She built her client base methodically. 6 families by 20, 8 by 21. But that was only the visible structure. The actual architecture was underneath. She had spent 2 years studying contract law through the lens of household staffing, because it turned out that the legal framework around domestic employment was intricate and largely unexamined by the people operating within it. Most nannies worked on handshakes and verbal agreements and goodwill. They had no contracts, no documentation of their credentials beyond a reference name and a phone number, and no legal protection when those arrangements ended badly. Mara had contracts with every family. She had written them herself after reading 12 different templates and 2 textbooks on contract drafting. And she had had a paralegal at the small firm on the north side look them over, in exchange for $30 and the professional courtesy of being taken seriously, which the paralegal, a woman named Grace, who had been doing that job for 11 years and was very tired of people underestimating her, appreciated enough to give Mara 3 hours of detailed feedback. The contracts covered scope of work, rate of pay, notice period, non-solicitation of competing services, and crucially, a clause about intellectual property as it pertained to any childcare methodology, routine documentation, or developmental programming created in the course of employment. This clause was non-standard. Most clients signed it without fully reading it because it was buried in paragraph 7 and was worded in language that was technically accessible but practically ignored. What it meant, in practice, was that if Mara developed a specific method of structuring a child's evening routine or documented a particular approach to managing separation anxiety, that documentation belonged to her professionally and could not be represented to a third party as originating elsewhere. She had designed this clause specifically for Dahlia. She had designed it before Dahlia had ever looked at childcare, before the Thanksgiving dinner that was still years away. And because the red notebook she kept, which she had transferred from memory into its new version, told her exactly what was coming, and she had decided, very quietly and very early, that she was not going to be stolen from again. Not because she had prevented the theft. She had done better than that. She had made the theft useless. Because a stolen credential with a documented paper trail of original ownership was not a credential. It was evidence. By the time she was 22, she had a professional reputation in her district that was built on specificity. She was not the cheapest option, she was not the most available or the most agreeable. She had a wait list, which she kept intentionally, and she had a profile on 2 reputable staffing directories that listed her credentials with documentation attached. The CPR certification, the early childhood development course she had taken at 20 through the community college, fully paid by then, but which had required 2 semesters of financial gymnastics that she did not enjoy but had planned for, the Montessori assistant training she completed in a weekend intensive that had cost $400, and which she had treated as a business investment. Everything listed with dates and verified documentation. She also had a business entity. This had taken her an afternoon at the county clerk's office and $80 in filing fees when she was 20. And it meant that she operated as a sole proprietorship with a registered trade name, Linden Child Care Services, rather than as an individual. This distinction was small administratively, but enormous in practice, because it meant that her professional reputation, her client contracts, and her documented credentials were tied to a business entity with a legal existence. And the business entity was hers alone and was not transferable by any action of Dahlia or the Hartwell Agency or anyone else. If Dahlia wanted to steal from Linden Child Care Services, she would need to commit a specific and documentable form of business fraud, which was a different proposition than sending a few texts from a borrowed phone. Mara knew Dahlia would try anyway. The habit was too structural. She had planned for that too. The call from the Vance family came in September of her 23rd year, which meant she was approximately 9 months ahead of the timeline she'd been quietly tracking. Mrs. Vance, Celeste, had gotten her name from 2 different sources. One was the Morrow family, who had been Mara's clients for 3 years, and whose daughter, a 4-year-old named Bea, had the kind of close-reading emotional intelligence that required a caretaker who could stay 1 step ahead of her, which Mara had managed without effort. The other source was a woman named Diana Holt at a charity gala, which Mara knew about because Grace the paralegal had a sister who worked events and had mentioned it casually. She had not engineered the introduction. It had happened because she had built something real, and real things traveled on their own. Mrs. Vance called on a Thursday. She had the particular phone manner of someone who was accustomed to professionals taking her calls, unhurried, slightly evaluative, but not unkind. She explained that she and her husband were looking for a full-time household manager with a childcare specialization for their 2 children, ages 3 and 6. The position would include live-in accommodation, a vehicle allowance, and a salary she mentioned without preamble, $95,000 annually with a performance review at 6 months. Mara was sitting at her kitchen table, a different table now, in a 1-bedroom she had moved into at 21, also above a dry cleaner's, but a different one, cleaner, better radiator. And she wrote the number down on the notepad she kept by the phone. She wrote it with the same pen and the same pressure she used for every note. She asked 3 questions. What was the start date? What were the children's current routines? And was the family open to reviewing a proposed contract template before the formal interview? Ms. Vance paused at the 3rd question. "Oh, then, we've never had anyone ask that before." "I find it saves time," Mara said. The pause again, shorter this time. "Yes, we'd be open to that." The Vance home was in the older part of the East Side, which had been going through a protracted and uneven revitalization for the better part of a decade. The street was quiet in the specific way of streets where the houses are set far back from the road, wide lawns, old trees, the kind of architecture that communicated not ostentation, but permanence. The house itself was a 1930s Tudor, stone and timber, with a slate roof and windows that had been replaced sometime in the past 10 years with units that were technically modern but had been chosen to maintain the original proportions. Mara pulled up in her car, a 7-year-old Honda that she had bought at 21 for $6,000 from a private seller whose listing she had found by checking 3 different platforms across 2 weeks, and who had accepted her cash offer without negotiating because she had done the research and come in at precisely the number that was fair and not $1 more, and sat for a moment. She looked at the house. She had never seen it before in this life. But she had seen it in the previous one, in a photograph on Mrs. Aldridge's sister's phone that she had happened to glance at during a birthday party. The Vances had been at that party, a peripheral family, barely noticed. Now they were her employers. She collected her folder, the contract template, the credential documentation, the reference letters from 3 current clients, the 1-page professional summary she had drafted and had Grace review, and got out of the car. The interview was conducted in the kitchen, which Mara noted, not the sitting room, not the office. The kitchen, at the round table near the window with the coffee maker running in the background. This was the test environment. They wanted to see how she moved in the domestic center of the house, how she handled the space, whether she seemed like someone who would alter the atmosphere in ways that were unmanageable. She sat down, accepted the coffee, and waited. Mr. and Mrs. Vance were in their late 30s. He was the kind of man whose confidence was structural rather than performed. It did not change when something unexpected happened, which Mara found reassuring because it suggested that he did not manage the household through anxiety. She was sharper, more verbal, the kind of person who processed by speaking, which meant she would sometimes say things she had not fully decided yet and then watch to see how they landed. Mara had worked with this type before and found them easier than the ones who said nothing, because at least you knew where you stood. The children were upstairs. She could hear them occasionally. A bump, a laugh, the particular acoustic signature of two small people living horizontally through a space. She answered their questions without embellishment. She described her background, the composition books, the documentation system, the business entity, and the contract structure, in the same tone she might describe the route she took to get there. Factual, precise, with no performance of humility or confidence. Just information. When Mrs. Vance asked why she had such an unusual documentation approach for childcare work, Mara said, "Because the work creates real professional value, and that value should be protected like any other professional asset." Mr. Vance looked at her for a moment, then he looked at his wife. Something passed between them that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, more like recalibration. "We've spoken to your references," he said. "All three?" "All three. One of them mentioned that you'd helped resolve a billing dispute with a previous agency." This was the Brewer family. The dispute had been over a 2-week notice period that the agency, not Hartwell, a different one, had billed them for incorrectly because the contract had been ambiguous. Mara had pointed out the ambiguity to the Brewers and helped them draft a letter requesting a formal review. She had not mentioned this in her summary. "I noticed the contract language was unclear," she said. "It seemed like a straightforward correction." "Mrs. Brewer said you quoted the relevant case law." "It wasn't complex case law. Standard service contract dispute. The principle is well established." Mr. Vance put his coffee mug down. "We have a particular situation," he said. Our previous household manager left under difficult circumstances and took a significant amount of documentation with her. Our son's developmental records, his therapeutic protocols, specific routines that the occupational therapist had recommended. She represented this information to a competing family as her own original methodology. Mara kept her expression even. That's a violation of professional duty, but potentially of intellectual property law depending on how the information was created and documented. We're in the process of consulting legal counsel about it. If the documentation was created in the course of her employment and the employment agreement, or lack of one, didn't specify ownership, the legal argument becomes about origination. Who created it and when? If you have dated records of the original material, that's your strongest ground, Mrs. Vance was looking at her with an expression that had shifted from evaluation to something closer to focus. The kind of look someone gives when they have found the specific tool they needed and are holding it, checking the weight. "The salary we mentioned on the phone," she said. "We'd like to adjust it." "To what?" $100,000 annually, with a quarterly review. Mara thought about this for exactly the amount of time it took to confirm that she had heard correctly. "I'd want to review the revised contract." "Of course. And I'd like to add a clause regarding documentation ownership that's more explicit than what's standard." "We expected you would," Mr. Vance said. And then something happened that was unusual in Mara's experience of professional negotiations. He smiled. Not warmly, not socially, the way someone smiles when a piece of a puzzle goes in. "We actually did some research on Linden Childcare Services before this interview. The structure is quite intentional." "Yes." "There's an article from a small professional newsletter, interview with a paralegal named Grace about emerging contract practices in household staffing." Mara had not known about the article. Grace had not mentioned it. She kept her face neutral. Grace is thorough. The article mentioned that the contract methodology was developed in collaboration with an unnamed client who was described as being in childcare professionally. I believe that was you." "Yes." Mrs. Vance leaned forward slightly. "We would like you to start the 1st of next month." Mara picked up her coffee. "I'll have a draft contract to you by Friday." She signed the contract with the Vances on a Tuesday and gave her existing clients 4 weeks' notice, which was 2 more than required by her contracts, but which felt correct. She helped the Morrow family transition to a new caretaker, helped them vet 2 candidates from the same directory she used, and recommended one of them. A woman named Terry, who had 2 years of experience and solid documentation, and whom Mara had quietly vetted through the professional network she had been building for 4 years. Dahlia called the following Thursday. She had heard, through some channel that Mara did not bother to trace, that Mara had taken a substantial position with a private family. Dahlia called in the mid-morning, which was when she usually called. It suggested that her schedule was flexible enough to be unstructured, which had not changed. And her voice had that particular quality of controlled neutrality that Dahlia used when she wanted information she could not ask for directly. "Mom mentioned you're doing really well." "Mom doesn't know much about my work," Mara said. She was standing at her kitchen window, still in the apartment she was leaving in 3 weeks, looking at the street. She said you took some big job." "I took a position. With a rich family? With a family that compensates fairly." Silence. Then, "You should list with the Hartwell agency. They're really expanding. I've been with them for almost a year." Mara knew this. Dahlia had joined Hartwell 8 months ago. She had been placed with the Calloway family, the Calloways, who in the previous timeline had been taken from Mara during the Thanksgiving dinner theft, and she was currently listed on their directory with 3 credentials that had been acquired in the original timeline by Mara. In this timeline, the credentials did not exist under Dahlia's name, because in this timeline, Mara had documented their acquisition under the Linden Childcare Services entity from the start, and the paper trail was clean and dated and legally specific. Dahlia had credentials listed that she could not have obtained without access to Mara's documentation from the previous life, which meant in this life, she had obtained them through some other channel, or, more likely, she had listed them without documentation, banking on the fact that most families did not verify beyond a phone reference. "I don't work through agencies," Mara said. "It's a good agency. I have a contract with my current placement, and I don't need a listing service." Another silence. Mara could hear the slight recalibration in it, the moment when Dahlia adjusted her approach. "I was thinking we could collaborate. You have contacts I don't have. I could refer families to you through Hartwell, take a finder's fee." "No." "Mara, I'm not interested in working through Hartwell. I'm not interested in a finder's fee arrangement. I have what I need." The silence this time was different, harder. You're being cold." "I'm being clear. There's a difference." Dahlia hung up. Mara stood at the window for another minute and then went back to packing. The Vance household had a specific rhythm that she understood within her first week. Mr. Vance, Oliver, left for his office at 7:30 and returned at 6:15 with the precision of someone who had calibrated his commute to the minute. Mrs. Vance, Celeste, worked from a home office 3 days a week and was in meetings for approximately 6 hours of each of those days, which meant the home needed to run with enough independence that she was not pulled out of her professional context by domestic friction. The children were James, who was 6, and had the wide-focused attention of a child who was processing the world slightly faster than his social experience had taught him to manage. And Ellie, who was 3 and had the physical confidence of someone who had not yet developed a full catalog of consequences. James had sensory sensitivities and had been working with an occupational therapist for 18 months. Ellie had a recently acquired commitment to having things done in a specific order that Mara recognized as a developmental phase, but that the previous household manager had apparently found baffling. She documented everything from the first day. Not ostentatiously. She was not walking around with a clipboard, but the composition book was on the kitchen counter from morning 1, and if either Oliver or Celeste noticed it, they did not mention it. By the end of her first week, she had a working profile for both children, James's sensory triggers and the specific sequence of environmental adjustments that prevented escalation, Ellie's routine requirements, and the 3 non-negotiable elements that had to be in place for morning transitions to work. She also had a preliminary household operations log, grocery cycles, appliance maintenance dates, the name and contact for the plumber who had been working with the house since it was built, and who was the only person whose judgment on the old pipes was worth taking. She started James's afternoon program on the 2nd week. She had designed it around the OT protocols, which the Vances had since recovered through their legal consultation because the documentation origination question had been resolved in their favor. with additions from the early childhood development training she had done at 20. She built it to James's specific profile, not to a general template, which meant it required more initial construction but produced faster results. By the 4th week, James's after-school transition, which had previously been a 40-minute negotiation involving significant emotional escalation, was running in 15 minutes. He went from the car to the kitchen to the decompression corner she had set up near the back window, which had the right natural light and a specific texture balance she had calibrated to his sensory preferences, and then to snack, and then to the homework table. It was not magic, and she did not present it as such. It was documentation and observation and adjustment, repeated. Celeste came into the kitchen one afternoon during the 4th week to find James at the homework table, working quietly, with Ellie drawing beside him, and the whole scene with the quality of something deliberate and calm. She stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. When she did speak, it was quiet. How? He needed the decompression time to be structured, not open-ended, Mara said, but not looking up from the vegetables she was cutting. Open-ended felt unpredictable to him. The corner has a defined start and end, which gives it a boundary he can feel. Celeste was quiet. We've been trying to give him more flexibility. Flexibility works well once the underlying regulation is stable. He's not there yet. When he is, you can introduce more variation gradually. Celeste sat down at the kitchen table. Oh, she had the posture of someone who had spent a month trying not to ask too many questions, and was now allowing herself one. Where did you learn this? Books, mostly. The OT you work with has published 2 papers on sensory regulation in early childhood. I read both of them. A pause. You read academic papers. I read anything relevant. Mara set down the knife and looked at her. He's doing well. The escalations at school are going to decrease in the next couple of weeks. Talk to his teacher about it. Let her know the home protocol is working so she can align the classroom approach. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. You are not like anyone we've had before. Mara went back to the cutting board. I know. The Thanksgiving dinner happened in November. She had been with the Vances for 2 months. So her mother had called in early November to extend the invitation in the specific way that was not really an invitation, but rather a scheduling information delivery. We're doing Thanksgiving at mine, 6 o'clock. Dahlia's bringing her boyfriend. The boyfriend was new information. Mara noted it without interest. She went because the calculus was simple. The Thanksgiving dinner was the site of the original betrayal, and she wanted to be present for whatever version of it arrived this time. Not because you learned more about a pattern from watching it attempt to operate than from avoiding it. She arrived at 5:45 with a sweet potato dish and a bottle of wine that she had selected based on what her mother actually liked rather than what seemed generous. Dahlia was already in the kitchen, white tea and bergamot, immediate. All the first breath through the door. And the boyfriend was on the couch watching television with the specific inertia of someone who had agreed to attend but had not agreed to participate. Dahlia looked good. She had the kind of surface-level polish that was easy to maintain when you were spending money you had taken from someone else's effort. And she moved through their mother's kitchen with the practiced authority of someone who belonged there more than the person they were looking at. She had done something with her hair. She was wearing a gold bracelet Mara did not recognize. You look good, Dahlia said, which was her version of I've been informed you're doing well, and I am managing that information. Thank you, Mara said, and put the sweet potato dish in the oven. The dinner was unremarkable for its first hour. Their mother talked about her neighbors. The boyfriend, his name was Doug, and he worked in insurance, which he described in a way that suggested he found it as interesting as everyone else found it. Ate 2 plates and said very little. Dahlia performed hosting in the way she always did, managing the table with the subtle authority of someone who needed to be seen as central to the event. Mara ate and listened and watched. She had left her phone in her coat pocket. See that it would have stayed there for the whole evening, except that around the 40-minute mark, she noticed that Dahlia was unusually interested in the coat rack. Not staring at it. She was too careful for that. But there was a particular quality of peripheral attention that Mara had spent 23 years learning to read. The small adjustments of posture toward an object of interest, the timing of when she went to refill her wine glass, which took her past the coats. Mara excused herself from the table, retrieved her coat, and brought it to her chair. She draped it over the back and let her phone be visible in the inner pocket, screen side out. Dahlia noticed. The peripheral adjustment corrected. She did not go to the coat rack again. The attempt, when it finally came, was different, subtler. After dinner, when the table was being cleared, Dahlia asked Mara directly, bright, social voice, much public setting, so that any discomfort on Mara's part would read as prickliness, for the names of the families she'd been working with before the Vance position, because I might be able to send them someone from Hartwell. They've all transitioned to new providers, Mara said. I managed the transitions before I left. All of them? All of them. The bright social voice did not waver, but something underneath it went still. That's very thorough of you. I believe in clean handoffs, Mara said, and picked up the casserole dish and took it to the kitchen. She heard, from the kitchen, Dahlia say something to their mother in a low voice. She did not try to make out the words. She rinsed the dish under warm water and thought about the red notebook, which was at the apartment, and specifically about one entry she had made at 18 when she had first started to understand the mechanism of what Dahlia did. No, not theft in the vulgar sense. Substitution. Dahlia did not want the thing itself. She wanted the place the thing occupied, the position in a network, the credibility attached to a name, the warmth of a relationship that had been built by someone else and was now available to inherit. You could not steal a position that was structurally attached to its builder. She finished rinsing the dish, dried her hands, and went back to the table for dessert. The Hartwell agency came up again in February. And this time it came up through a professional channel rather than a personal one. A family named the Reeds, who had been clients of Hartwell's for 2 years, and had been placed with a caretaker who had recently departed, contacted Linden Childcare Services through the directory listing. They had found her through the same newsletter article that Oliver Vance had mentioned during the interview. She took a consultation call with them on a Wednesday evening. They had 2 children, 4 and 7, sought and were looking for a part-time arrangement, 3 days a week, to supplement their current schedule. She was full-time with the Vances and could not take the position, but she gave them 45 minutes of her time and answered their questions about what to look for, what contract terms to insist on, how to evaluate a candidate's documentation. At the end of the call, Mrs. Reed, Patricia, said, "The person we had before from Hartwell. We found out later she listed credentials that weren't verified. Hartwell told us they'd looked into it and everything was fine, but then we called the certifying body and the name wasn't in their records." "What credentials?" "An early childhood development certification. From a state program." Patricia paused. "The name of the business on the credential was Linden something. I remember because it was the same as your name." Mara did not react. "Linden Childcare Services?" "Yes. But the person at Hartwell wasn't you. Completely different person." "What was her name?" "Dahlia Chen." Mara took the pen from beside the notepad on her kitchen table. She wrote the name down even though she did not need to. She wrote it because the act of writing it in this context, on the notepad, with the pen, as a professional fact, felt like the correct acknowledgement of the moment. "I'd like to get a copy of the credential she presented, if you still have it," she said. "Oh, for my records. Is she related to you?" "She's my sister." The silence on Patricia Reed's end was the specific silence of someone revising their read of a situation. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," Mara said. "Can you send me the document?" She had it by Friday. It was a PDF, photographed slightly off-center, and it was a real credential document from the state program, correctly formatted, with all the right institutional markings. The name on it was Linden Childcare Services. The registered holder of the credential was listed as D. Chen, which was impossible because the credential was registered under the state's professional database, and the registration for Linden Childcare Services was under M. Chen, and had been since Mara was 20 years old. You could not register a credential under a business entity you did not own. The only way to have a credential document that said Linden Childcare Services and D. Chen was to have created one that did not actually exist in the state database, to have altered or fabricated a document. Document fraud. Specifically, falsification of a professional credential used in the context of paid employment. That was not a civil matter. That was a criminal one. She printed the PDF. She placed it in a folder. She took the folder to Grace, who was no longer a paralegal but had completed her law degree at 34 and was now at a small firm that did, among other things, professional misconduct and fraud cases. Grace looked at the document for 3 minutes. She looked at the Linden Child Care Services registration paperwork Mara had brought with her. She looked at the date on the credential document Dahlia had presented to the Reeds. "This is fabricated," Grace said. "Yes. Do you know of other families she presented this to?" "No, but I know the Hartwell agency handled the placement." "Oh, which means they may have processed this document as part of their client intake, which makes them potentially liable for presenting a fraudulent credential to a client." Grace looked at her. "Have you always been this organized?" "For a while," Mara said. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" Mara thought about it for exactly the amount of time it required. "Not yet. I want to send a formal notification to the state credentialing body and to the Hartwell agency. And I want it documented and on record, and I want it sent with your firm's letterhead." "And Dahlia?" "She'll receive a copy." Grace nodded. She was not surprised. She had spent 11 years as a paralegal and 3 as an attorney, and had learned that the people who came in with the clearest documentation usually also had the cleanest objectives. "I'll draft it by next Thursday." "Wednesday would be better." "Wednesday," Grace said. The letter went out on a Wednesday in March. It was addressed to 3 parties: the State Office of Professional Standards, which oversaw credentialing for early childhood development practitioners, the Hartwell Agency for Household Staffing, and Dahlia Chen, care of the address on file with the State Professional Registry. It detailed, with attached documentation, the existence of the Linden Child Care Services business registration under M. Chen's name, the credential registration under the same entity also under M. Chen's name, and the credential document presented to the Reed family listing D. Chen as the registered holder under the same entity. It noted the factual incompatibility of these documents under state registration law. It noted that the Reeds had retained the original document as provided to them by Hartwell during the placement process. It noted that this matter was being referred to the Office of Professional Standards for formal review, and that Mara was preserving the right to pursue additional legal remedies depending on the findings of that review. It did not name a dollar amount. It did not make a threat. It stated facts and attached evidence, and used the language of professional and legal process without the language of personal grievance. Because personal grievance was expensive in every dimension, and Mara had no interest in the performance of it. The letter was 4 pages. It was the quietest thing she had ever done, and also the most forceful. She sent it certified mail. She kept copies. She filed one with the composition book system. She did not tell her mother. She did not call Dahlia. She simply sent the letters and went back to the Vance house and made dinner and helped James with his reading and put Ellie to bed with the specific sequence of goodnight events. The small light, the particular blanket, the 30-second song that Ellie required and that Mara had documented in week 2, and which now ran without any discussion because everyone in the household knew the protocol. Dahlia called on a Friday. Mara let it go to voicemail. And with the voicemail was 90 seconds of her sister's voice cycling through several registers. Confusion, then a performance of calm, then something close to actual feeling, which was unusual for Dahlia and which Mara noted, before arriving at, "I don't understand why you did this. I just needed to get established. You were always ahead of me, Mara. You always had more than me." Mara listened to it twice. The second time she listened, not for content, but for structure. Because she was interested in the architecture of Dahlia's self-narrative. The framing was consistent. Mara had more, therefore the redistribution was logical. It was not malice in Dahlia's account. It was correction. She deleted the voicemail and put the phone in her pocket. The Office of Professional Standards responded in 6 weeks. They opened a formal review. The Hartwell Agency, upon being notified of the review, conducted an internal audit of the credential documentation they had processed for Dahlia Chen and found 2 additional families to whom she had been placed using documentation that did not match the state database. Hartwell's legal team contacted Grace's firm to discuss liability, which was a conversation Grace handled with the calm competence of someone who had been doing this longer than her years as an attorney suggested, because she had. As Dahlia's listing was suspended from the Hartwell Agency pending the review, The suspension was not the same as a termination and did not necessarily lead to one, but it meant she was not placeable through that agency during the review period, which was estimated at 4 to 6 months. Mara did not follow this closely. She tracked it the way she tracked the maintenance schedule for the Vance house plumbing, periodically, systematically, without urgency. Because it was a process that was running correctly and did not require her to be actively managing it. What she was actively managing was the program she had been developing for James, which at the 4-month mark was producing results that his OT had described in her session notes as significant, and which she had asked Mara to detail in writing so she could share the methodology with colleagues. This was the 3rd time someone had asked about the methodology. The first had been Celeste. The second had been the pediatrician, who had asked at James's 6-month well visit after reading the summary Mara had prepared. She had begun drafting a formal document. Not an academic paper, that was a different project for a different season, but a structured methodology guide for the specific protocol she had built for James, anonymized, framed as a general approach for children with his profile. She had been working on it in the evenings, after the house was quiet. Yet at the small desk in the room that had been designated as her office, which had a window that faced the back garden and good light in the early morning. She was at the desk one evening in April when Celeste knocked and came in without waiting, which was unusual. She had a particular posture Mara recognized as the one she wore when she had information to deliver that she wasn't sure how to frame. "We had dinner last week with the Alderton family," Celeste said. Oh, she sat in the chair across from the desk. "They're looking for someone." "I know the name. I haven't worked with them." "No, but their current situation is... the person they have has been there for 4 years and is leaving to manage her own family. And it's a significant position. They have 3 children, 2 of whom have complex needs, and they're not sure the standard agency route is going to produce the right candidate. What are they looking for? Someone who can do what you do." Celeste said it simply. "I told them about the documentation system, the contract structure, the methodology you built for James. Charles Alderton asked if you'd be willing to consult, not to leave us, but to advise on what they should look for." Mara looked at her for a moment. A consulting arrangement. Paid separately. He suggested a day rate. "What day rate?" Celeste named a number. Mara kept her expression even. She wrote it on the corner of the document she was working on. "I'd want to review any consulting contract separately from my arrangement with you," she said. "Of course. And the work with the Alderitons wouldn't overlap with my responsibilities here." "That's what I told him." Celeste paused. "Mara, you know you've changed this household." "The household has changed itself," Mara said. James did the work. I just arranged the conditions." Celeste looked at her with the expression she occasionally wore. Not sentimentality, not quite, but something in the vicinity of it, tempered by the practical intelligence that was her dominant register. "That is the most infuriatingly exact thing you could have said." Mara went back to the document. "I'll reach out to Charles Alderton next week." The consulting arrangement began in May. It was a 3-month engagement, structured as an advisory contract under Linden Childcare Services, which meant it was separate from the Vance employment, billed separately, and fully documented. The Alderton family had 3 children. Marcus, 9, who was autistic and in a specialized school program that the family was uncertain was correctly calibrated to his needs. Nora, 6, who had a recent diagnosis of anxiety disorder that had not yet been incorporated into the household routine in any systematic way. And Leo, 4, who had no formal diagnoses and a tremendous amount of energy and a deep commitment to doing every single thing his siblings did, regardless of whether that thing was appropriate for a 4-year-old. Mara spent the first 2 weeks in observation. She attended 3 days at the Alderton house across the first week during the afternoon and evening transition hours, and she sat in rooms and watched and did not offer opinions. She wrote in the composition book. And she spoke to the departing household manager, a woman named Sylvie, who had been there for 4 years and who was leaving with obvious ambivalence, the specific ambivalence of someone who genuinely cared about the family and was uncertain her replacement would understand them, and asked her to describe, in as much detail as she was willing to share, the undocumented knowledge she had about each child. Sylvie, You, who had expected to be treated as a reference at best and a potential liability at worst, responded to being genuinely asked with the particular relief of someone who had been carrying a weight they were glad to set down. They spoke for 3 hours across 2 sessions. Mara transcribed the second session, with Sylvie's permission, and incorporated it into the candidate profile document she was building. The document ran to 26 pages. It covered the routine requirements for each child, the sensory and emotional profiles, the communication approaches that worked, and those that had been tried and failed, the family's dynamics, their communication style, the specific logistical rhythms of the household, and a recommended candidate profile including the specific professional background, documentation habits, and contractual requirements that Mara believed would produce the right match. She presented it to Charles and Helen Alderton in their kitchen, which was the choice she made deliberately. Not the office, not the formal sitting room, because the kitchen was where the work happened, and the work was what she was there to discuss. She walked through the document in an hour. She left 12 pages of candidate criteria and contract recommendations with them. She recommended 2 professional networks to post the position in, and she offered to review the first 3 applications herself and provide initial assessments. Helen Alderton, who had barely spoken during the first 2/3 of the presentation, and whose silence Mara had read correctly as the processing silence of someone with a high standard for information, said at the end, "Where did you train?" "I didn't," Mara said. "I taught myself." "Through books?" "Books, practice, documentation, and a very good paralegal." Charles was looking at the methodology appendix, which was the section that detailed the specific framework she had built for Marcus's after-school protocol. "This is published anywhere?" "Not yet." "You should publish it." "I'm working on that." He looked up. "Would you be willing to teach a workshop? We're on the board of a family services organization. They run professional development for childcare workers. What you've built here would change how people work." Mara thought about this. She thought about the 17-year-old at the kitchen table with the borrowed notebook. She thought about the red notebook. She thought about the intersection at Farwell and 9th, which she had not driven through since coming back, not even once, which was irrational because it was simply an intersection, and the particular car and the particular moment were 6 years away from this body, and yet she preferred another route. "Yes," she said. I'd be willing." The review from the Office of Professional Standards concluded in June. The findings were unfavorable for Dahlia. The review confirmed that the credential documents presented to 3 Hartwell-placed families had been falsified. They contained correct institutional markings and formats, but listed a business entity under a name that did not match the registered holder, which constituted material misrepresentation in a professional context. And the review recommended that Dahlia's listing be permanently suspended from the Hartwell agency and that the matter be referred to the County District Attorney's Office for determination of whether criminal charges were warranted. The referral to the DA was not an automatic charge, it was a question. The DA's office would review and decide whether to pursue. Grace had advised Mara, when the process was ongoing, that this was the most likely outcome and that the DA's determination would depend on factors including the financial harm to the families, the degree of intentionality, and prosecutorial priorities in the current period. Mara had thought about what she wanted from that process and had arrived at a specific answer. She wanted the record. She wanted the findings in a formal, publicly accessible document. She did not particularly need a criminal conviction, though if the DA pursued one, she would cooperate fully with whatever they needed. What she needed was the documented version of what had happened, because the documented version was permanent, in a way that a phone call, or a confrontation, or even a formal apology was not. She did not contact Dahlia after the findings came out. She did not contact her mother to discuss it. She waited to see if Dahlia would call. Dahlia did not call. And the summer was orderly in the way that the Vance household had become orderly. Not quiet exactly, because James and Ellie were 6 and 3 and those were not quiet ages, but structured in a way that meant the noise was contained within a known shape. She had designed the summer schedule in April and had built in the flexibility points that she knew both children would need, which were different flexibility points from each other. James needed known flexibility, transitions that were announced, variations that were described in advance so his expectation could incorporate them. Ellie needed tactile flexibility, the freedom to follow her physical impulses within a defined safe space, which Mara had mapped out in the back garden with what had become a surprisingly elaborate outdoor organization system that Oliver had watched develop over 2 weekends with the expression of a man who found precision comforting. She was in the back garden on a Thursday in July, adjusting the outdoor activity station, when her phone buzzed. It was a number she did not recognize, with a local area code. She let it ring twice and then answered. "Is this Mara Chen of Linden Childcare Services?" The voice was a woman's, professional, with the slight formality of someone making a business call rather than a personal one. "Yes. My name is Dr. Patricia Wells. I'm with the Children's Developmental Institute on the North Side. Oh, we've received your methodology document. Dr. Alderton shared it with our clinical director last month, and we'd like to speak with you about a potential collaboration." Mara sat down on the edge of the garden bench. Ellie was at the activity station, focused on a puzzle component. James was inside reading, which he did voluntarily on Thursdays since April, which was its own kind of milestone. "What kind of collaboration?" she said. "Oh, we're developing a training curriculum for home-based developmental support practitioners. Essentially, the professional layer between clinical OT and daily caregiving. It's a gap we've identified repeatedly. The work isn't being done at the household level with any consistency, and when it is, it's not documented or transferable. Your framework addresses both of those problems." Mara thought about the workshop Charles Alderton had mentioned. She thought about the second part of the list she had written at 17, how to build something that cannot be replicated by someone who does not understand why it works. The answer, she had found, was not to protect it from being replicated. It was to be the one who built the understanding. If she was the origin point, the source, the person whose name was on the earliest dated documentation, then replication only spread her reach. It did not diminish her position. "Oh, I'd like to meet," she said. "I can come to you next week. Tuesday or Wednesday?" "Wednesday," she said, because Wednesday was when Grace had sent the letter, and she had a small private attachment to that day now. It was the day things were sent into the world with her name on them and did not require her to watch. She met Dr. Wells on a Wednesday morning. The institute was in a converted school building on the north side. Brick, old. As the kind of building that had been a dozen things before, it became what it currently was, which was a hybrid clinical and training space for developmental practitioners. Dr. Wells was younger than her voice suggested, early 40s, with the focused directness of someone who spent most of her time around people whose communication was complex and had therefore developed a strong preference for straightforward professional exchange. She had printed the methodology document. She had annotated it. Oh, there were questions written in the margins in a small, precise hand. They spent 2 hours going through it. Mara answered the questions and answered the follow-up questions, and when she did not have an answer, twice, on points that touched on clinical practice beyond her professional scope, she said so directly, which Dr. Wells marked with the slight nod of someone who had been watching for honesty. At the end of the 2 hours, Dr. Wells pushed the annotated document across the table. "We want to develop this into a 12-module curriculum. We would work with you to ensure clinical accuracy, and the curriculum would be piloted through our training program in the spring. The framework would be published under your name and Linden Childcare Services as a co-development with the Institute. What's the commercial structure? The curriculum would be licensed for use in our training program. You would retain ownership of the underlying methodology. A revenue share at 22% of net licensing income after the first year, when we've established the enrollment base." Mara looked at the annotated document and at the margin notes in the small, precise hand. At her own framework examined by someone who had been working in this field for 15 years and had found it worth 2 hours of careful annotation. 25%, she said. Dr. Wells looked at her without surprise. 24, with first right of review on any revisions to the core methodology. Yes, Mara said. They shook hands. Dr. Wells' grip was firm and brief. The workshop that Charles Alderton had mentioned came together in September through the family services organization he had referenced. It was a half-day professional development session for household childcare practitioners, nannies, au pairs, household managers. And Mara had designed it herself. Asa built it around 3 of the 12 modules she was developing for the Institute's curriculum. It was the first time she had stood in front of a room in a professional capacity and delivered information she had created. And she noticed, standing at the front of the room, with 32 people looking at her from chairs arranged in a loose horseshoe, that she was not nervous. She was simply ready. She had been ready for 6 years. Hours the preparation had been long and unglamorous and had taken place in small rooms and libraries and over kitchen tables and in the margins of law school textbooks borrowed from a librarian who had given her a sideways look and stamped them without comment. It had required the specific discipline of someone who knew what was coming and had decided that knowing was only useful if you used it methodically. She taught the workshop. She answered questions for 45 minutes after. She stayed until the room was empty. She drove back to the Vance house in the Honda. She had not replaced it and did not plan to because it ran well and she had no interest in spending money to communicate something she did not need to communicate. And she arrived in the early evening to find Oliver in the kitchen making dinner, because he did that on Thursdays now, and James at the kitchen table with his homework. And Ellie asleep already, because she had dropped from a 2-hour afternoon nap to 40 minutes, and was consequently wrecked by 6 p.m., which was a developmental progression that Mara had noted in the composition book, and had described to Celeste in enough detail that Celeste had stopped worrying about it. Oliver looked up. "How was the workshop?" "Productive," Mara said. She set her bag down and looked at James's homework. "Are you doing the fractions one?" James looked up. I hate fractions." "I know. Get through 3 problems and then we'll eat." She sat down across from him. She pulled the composition book toward her and opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She began the evening entry. 3 weeks later, Dahlia called. She called in the morning, which was no longer the time of flexible schedules and empty hours. Mara was in the Vance kitchen reviewing the week's schedule when the phone rang, and she saw the name and considered letting it go to voicemail again, and then decided against it. Not because she had changed her calculus about Dahlia, because she wanted to hear what form this particular call would take. "Hey," Dahlia said. Her voice was different from the previous calls. The social register, the practiced warmth, and the managed neutrality was not present. What was there instead was something lower, more careful. The voice of someone who has revised their understanding of a situation and is approaching the conversation with that revision visible. "Hello?" Mara said. "I know you're busy. A pause. "I wanted to talk." "What about?" "The review, the Hartwell thing." Another pause, and then, without the frame of grievance she had used in the voicemail, "I should have told you what I was doing." "Yes." "I know you built that. The certification, the whole system. I know it was yours." A third pause. And in it, Mara could hear the structural cost of what Dahlia was doing. She was describing a reality that her narrative had not previously accommodated, and it required effort. "I told myself you wouldn't miss it, that you had more than enough." "I know what you told yourself." The silence. Not the managed kind, the real kind. "The DA," Dahlia said. Are you going to? "That's not my decision," Mara said. "I referred the matter and I provided documentation. Thus the DA will make their own determination." "What did you tell them?" "The facts. I told them the facts." Another silence. Mara looked at the schedule on the kitchen counter. James was at school, Ellie was in the playroom, Celeste was in her office. The day was arranged and running. "I don't know what to do," Dahlia said. "I'd suggest consulting a lawyer," Mara said. "A real one, not the agency kind." "Mara, I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Mara said. And I'm not going to tell you how to feel about it. What I'll tell you is that the documentation is clean, and the timeline is clear, and whatever happens next will happen based on those facts, not on anything I do from this point." "That sounds like you washing your hands of it." "It sounds like the situation as it exists," Mara said. "I have to get back to work." She ended the call. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter beside the composition book. She stood for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. The specific Wednesday morning quiet, Oliver at the office, Ellie's distant sound from the playroom, the radiator not cracking here, but making a low hum that she had cataloged in the maintenance log and which the plumber had confirmed was normal and non-urgent. She opened the composition book to the current week. She uncapped the pen. She wrote the next item in the schedule and moved forward into the day. The 12-module curriculum launched in piloted form the following April through the Institute's spring training program. 43 practitioners enrolled. The evaluation forms, which came back 6 weeks into the program, had one recurring phrase in the open text sections, variations on the same idea expressed in 43 different handwritings. I didn't know this could be written down like this. Mara read them at the small desk in her office at the Vance house, the one with the window facing the back garden. The garden was April bare, but the beds had been turned and the first small things were coming up. James had planted bulbs in October under Mara's instruction. He liked systems, liked putting something in the ground, and knowing it would follow a specific sequence. And they were emerging in the predictable order she had described to him, which he checked each morning before school with a particular satisfaction. She filed the evaluation forms in a folder. She noted the feedback in the composition book. She drafted a summary for Dr. Wells, flagged the 2 modules that had produced the most confusion for revision, and recommended 3 additional topics based on the questions the practitioners had raised. She was 24 years old. She had a $100,000 salary, a consulting arrangement with 2 families, a curriculum in its first licensed deployment, and a registered business entity with a paper trail that was now 5 years old and thoroughly documented and attached to her name in every database where names like hers appeared. She also had the red notebook. She did not look at it often anymore. She had transferred its contents to an encrypted digital file at 22 and kept the notebook itself because she had a habit of keeping documentation that she was not prepared to discard. And so she was sitting at the desk that April evening, and she had taken it out for no particular reason. The way you sometimes reach for something old, not because you need it, but because you need to confirm it still exists. She opened it to the last page she had written, the one she had added to the list at 20, after the 2nd year of building, when she had understood something that she could not have articulated at 17, the final item in the What I Need to Know list. And the one she had added after the original 12, it read, How to build something that my sister cannot inherit from me by taking the position and leaving the work behind. The answer, which had taken 4 more years to fully arrive at, make the work inseparable from the understanding. Dahlia could copy a credential document, she could forward a contact list, she could take a position in a network that had been built by someone else. Well, what she could not do was produce 26 pages of annotated methodology and have it hold up under the scrutiny of a clinical director who had spent 15 years in the field. She could not walk into a room of 32 professionals and answer 45 minutes of questions from a place of genuine, structured knowledge. She could not sit across from a child with sensory processing challenges and build, through observation and documented adjustment, as a protocol that his occupational therapist asked about in writing. You could steal the surface of a thing. You could not steal the interior. And if you built something that was only possible because of what lived in your interior, then what you had built was, for practical purposes, unthieveable. She closed the red notebook. She put it back in the desk drawer. From the hallway, she heard James walking to the bathroom for his bedtime routine. She knew the sequence of his steps now. The specific rhythm that meant everything was regulated and nothing needed attention. 4 steps to the door, pause at the threshold, light on. He was doing well. He had been doing well for months. His teacher had sent home a note the previous week that used the phrase independent work strategies, which was the specific phrase the OT had told Mara to listen for. She got up from the desk, turned off the lamp, and went down the hall to start the last check of the evening. The house was quiet in the way houses were quiet when they were running correctly, not silent, but settled. The particular acoustic texture of a place that knew what it was doing and did not require anything extra to make that clear. She checked the back door, checked the thermostat, noted in the maintenance log that the kitchen faucet had a minor drip that had not been there last week and that she would mention to Oliver in the morning. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment in the dark. The street outside was empty. One light down the block was on. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.